Hey there, Internet. Welcome to the Hard on Gear channel, where I discuss and review my used and abused knives and gear so that you know what is or isn't worth spending your hard-earned money on. Time to look at the very first big, bad, fixed blade knife I ever purchased, and the first knife that I ever really started to beat the crap out of, and well, probably the knife that made me realize there's some tools that stand up to a little more use and abuse than others. There's quite a few videos of this knife out there, but not a lot that completely cover everything I'd like to hear covered in the video. So if you don't have all day, just stick around for the first 5-10 minutes of this video. I'll get most of the really important specs out of the way, then I'll talk about some other stuff. But there's going to be timestamps as well if you want to just skip ahead to whatever you're looking to find out. The Cold Steel Recon 1 along with the K-Bar Large Heavy Bowie were the two knives that really solidified my need for more hard use knives, and they made me realize that it's worth spending a little extra time doing a little bit of research just to find out what you're paying for. And if you're going to pay $100 roughly for something versus $50-$60, that extra $50 spent might be well worth you getting 8-10 years of use out of a piece of gear over something like, well, this hunk of junk, which is only going to last you so long unless you treat your stuff like glass. So I purchased this knife in 2013, the same year as I bought the Recon 1, just to get a large fixed blade that I could use for work and forestry school and anything in the woods where I might need to chop something down. So while this is a big badass model, which I very much enjoy, K-Bar discontinued this, I believe, in 2016. A lot of folks who've used this knife, like myself, were quite disappointed in that. I really don't have a good reason as to why they discontinued this. I've searched around the internet a little bit. From all I can tell, they just had better replacements in the Becker collaboration lines. The only thing perhaps that's crossed my mind is that the swedge is so overwhelming at the top of the blade here that there's, it limits the batoning ability compared to some of the thicker blade stock knives that go all the way up to the tip. But you can still find these on the secondary market for a reasonable price. I paid around $100 for this knife, somewhere between $90 and $100 Canadian. I think you could get it for around $60 American. But if you can find one of these on the secondary market that's not in too bad a shape, I'd go for it. And this one, being one of my top 3 hardest used knives that I've ever owned, I've never cleaned this thing. I've only sharpened it a couple times, and I've done terrible things with this knife. But it's not actually that worn down, and if you took a little bit of time to polish this up, there's a little bit of a scuff here at the base of the pommel, but another one up here. Those are probably from throwing it. I shouldn't do that. But really, I could probably resell this without too much issue, getting probably most of what I paid for out of it, being that it's discontinued. So the blade, 9 inches total blade length, with about 8.5 inches. Large sharpening choil here at the base kind of takes away a little bit. But yeah, no, you've got about 8.25 inches of real cutting surface and 9 inch total. And then the entire knife is a big bad 14 inches. 14 and a quarter. So it's probably overkill unless you're doing big, large outdoor bush tasks. I don't know what a large outdoor bush task is, but something that involves you cutting big pieces of wood or chopping things or batoning things. Something where something like a Recon 1 actually isn't quite enough. Which there's not a lot of tasks where you couldn't get away with doing a lot of those things with something like a Recon 1. So my scale here is a little off. It's about 0.1, 0.2 light, so you're going to see 5.1 instead of 5.3 for the Recon 1. So keeping that in mind, we've got about 15 ounces, which is about right because this thing's supposed to be just shy of a pound. See the sheath. Sheath is 4.5 ounces, so that means all together with the knife and the sheath, you're looking at a little over a pound and 3 ounces and change. Let's do some size comparisons. So with the sheath, this knife is gigantic. We're going to take it out of there. When I was even dumber, I purchased this knife back when I was 18, 19, and I'm going to rant about it again a little bit here, but I'll do a full video talking about why I do not like them and why I'm mad at the gimmicky bullshit that roped me into buying this knife. But essentially, there's your Gerber Bear Grylls collaboration. Size comparison wise, this is probably pretty average to a lot of your standard Gerbers and different fixed blade knives that a lot of folks are going to be used to using, especially on the cheaper budget end of ththings. Here's your more companion. Talk about common budget fixed blades people should be familiar with. And we'll stick the Grohmann D.H. Russell #1 design. Gotta get some oil on that sucker. Next to that as well. The K-Bar USMC, a little less intimidating. On fire exports, if we're going in where I know there's going to be like a lot of wilderness and bear country, coyotes, maybe wolves, different things, very slim chance you're ever going to need something, but it does make me feel a little more confident having something this size on me. If we're going into BC, and I think we're going to be around grizzly country, as stupid as it sounds, This is my grizzly knife, and if I ever did run into a big-ass grizz, I'm going to hope it never came down to me having to use this against, well, each of his claws are about, yeah, and his paws are about, yeah, and I don't really feel like messing with that, but it makes me feel a little bit safer if I'm in the woods and I hear a crack in the woods, putting my hand at my hip and feeling this thing down there gives me a little bit of, I guess, a false sense of security that at least gets me through that little moment of indecision. So the blade steel, it's commonly called 1095 by a lot of people, but this is actually 1085. Is that relevant? I don't think really at all. It's basically just a minuscule difference in the composition of the blade steel, but from what little tiny bit I could find online about the difference between 1095 and 1085 carbon steel, it's very negligible, not even worth talking about. If there are any blade steel experts in the comment section, feel free to correct me and let me know if I'm off on that a little bit. But from what I gather, this should be pretty much the same as any 1095 high carbon steel that you get from SE or Tops or K-Bar, any other fixed blade company who's going to use that 1095. The Rockwell hardness rating of this too is about 55 to 57, which is the same as the SE knives. From what the internet says, not a metallurgy expert in case anyone's missed that. But yeah, should pretty much expect this to be able to perform as good as any high quality, high carbon steel. On the blade, you've got K-Bar on one side, which is typical for many K-Bar knives, and then you've got Taiwan, which is where the knife is manufactured, and 1277, which is the model number. So K-Bar, the 1211, 1212, 1213, 1214, those basic USMC models that everyone's quite familiar with. That's the same idea as this 1277 model. All those K-Bar fixed blades have got that somewheres in that range of normally that 1200 number, depending on the knife. The handle's the Creighton G polymer plastic, the same that's on the USMC K-Bar 1211. That's the same kind of plastic, grippy-ish material. It's better than a lot of stuff. The way the handle is formed with that material actually makes it extremely secure. Use this almost like a hatchet, to be honest, the way that handle curves around the bottom of your hand at the pommel. And when this thing gets wet in your hand, the grip really doesn't get any worse from what I do recall from the many times using this, either sweating and or in rain or wet, woody environments. The blade, we've got this very Bowie style, as it is a Bowie knife, Bowie style clip point type thing going on here with a very large swedge. I don't know what to call it other than a very, very large, maybe over-exaggerated swedge near the top, the front half of the blade. Blade stock is pretty thick at, geez, what is that, about 1/4 of an inch? That's pretty massive. 7 millimeters. With a full flat grind, it doesn't get super thin and slicey like if it was a hollow grind Bowie knife, but you do still have pretty good slicing capabilities with this. I've used this for all kinds of chopping, cooking, and different tasks over the years, and I can really tell you there's no issue with getting this through a piece of wood or a piece of paper if you really want to see. Now, let's just see. I haven't sharpened this thing in a long time, but I'm fairly sure, mind you, that rips. Yeah, we're still going to get some decent cuts. Mind you, oh, sorry camera, this is going to be a bush knife, not a fine carving paper knife. So yeah, okay, I'll eat my words a little bit here and say it's not as sharp as I hoped, but it's still, for something I have not touched up in a good while, very capable of making some nice slices for as thick of a blade as it is. The batoning can be done, but it's not as nice as a full thick blade stock all the way out to the tip, or something a little less thinned out at the edge. However, I don't baton a whole lot with my knives. I do have axes and machetes, different things like that in my arsenal in my car if I happen to be in one of those situations. With that being said, this thing has been used for many, many hacking jobs. Like I mentioned in other videos, I have cut down trees with this around 8-9 inches in diameter I'd say without too much effort. It's going to take a lot of effort to cut down a tree with a knife like this, but nonetheless, compared to doing it with any other tool or different knives, this thing works much more like a small hatchet than I could have ever expected. More so than it probably needs to, because you really shouldn't be using a knife for stuff like that. But if you ever did get in a situation where you did need it to, it's good to know it can hold up to that kind of abuse. And it's really worth mentioning, I've only sharpened this thing a couple times, so it's got no nicks, no major issues on the edge. And I have, like I said, beat this thing off of many things, thrown this at many trees, done a whole bunch of stuff that you shouldn't do with your knives, and haven't had any issues. A late Boy Scouts video from like, 9 or 10 years ago, he's got a huge chip out in his that did occur from doing some different, I think, baton style type woodwork. However, K-Bar did apparently replace it for him, and they hooked him up with the warranty and everything in place for if you do happen to do something like that to your K-Bar knife. Shouldn't be an issue, but just so you know, it's possible you can chip it. Hopefully not, and you shouldn't, but K-Bar should help you out with their warranty if you run into that situation. So full tang all the way through here, but as you can see, it certainly does taper down into the handle, much like the K-Bar 1211, where it gets a little skinny inside of there. So you could see that potentially breaking around there if it were to break. But because there's so much weight and leverage on this end of the knife, the blade's so long, I don't know what the hell you'd be doing to this thing to have that snap in there. The sheath could be better, and I'll just say right quick that I'm not the biggest fan of this thing. However, I've used it a ton. You can see some other videos where this loop really doesn't look much different than black leather, but I've worn this thing down quite a bit, and I use this thing mostly as a dangle carry. The loop that used to be at the bottom has been long ripped off. There was a little loop there that you could tie some paracord to if you wanted to loop it to your leg or to your pack better. To me, it was just, it kind of limited my mobility, and as much as this can be a pain having it dangle around loosely, it allows you to freely move it around if you're getting in and out of vehicles, or if you're getting in and off the ground, or using different hand tools or something like that, where you don't need this thing restricting your movement and how much you can bend at the hip and the leg. These double snaps work pretty well, and it's pretty intuitive if you want to hook them up so that they're opposite of each other, so that you just have to do a little bit of a twist and you pop them both open. I've made the mistake before of not doing those up and allowing it to dangle. That's a terrible idea, and the knife will fall out, and people will tell you, hey, your big dumb knife fell out, you idiot. The sheath's half leather on the back and nylon in the front, and this is better than some sheaths, but not the best. You can see it's just a cardboard inlay, or whatever you want to call it, on the inside, a cardboard skeleton to it. And the tip does poke out of this from throughout the years, it just not being quite long enough to reach the bottom, or the length of the sheath rather being just longer so that it gets a little bit bent if it does get jammed up against something. So over the years, that has worn down. You can kind of see the imprint here, I think, from where that knife actually sits in the sheath, and that little bit of extra room has allowed allowed some wiggle room. Not a big deal. I have kind of lightly poked myself with that tip of the knife poking out of there before, and you'd want to be very careful getting in and out of nice vehicles, or any vehicle, to be honest, just so you're not ripping the seats out or doing anything like that. But the rivets have all stayed intact, and yeah, I mean, really, it's held up to a lot of damage and a lot of rough use over the years that a lot of Kydex sheaths might not have. For example, the sheath that comes with the K-Bar 1211. This is actually my second sheath with this, because I did bust this area where these two rivets hook in. So maybe this is a little bit better design in some ways, but in the end, I kind of like the full Kydex better. So as far as any kind of screws or things to take apart in this knife, there's none of that. You could probably maybe figure out a way. No, there's just, I'm thinking maybe you could get that tang out of there, but it seems like everything's pretty much hooked in the way it's going to be hooked in. So play around with it if you want, but to me, there's really no point of taking apart something that's built so solid like this when there's nothing to clean anyways. And even if there was, who cares? It's a work knife. So K-Bar itself as a brand's pretty cool. But the very first video I ever put out was the K-Bar 1211 review. Near the very beginning of that video, you can hear the story behind K-Bar, how they got their cool name, and how it relates to killing a bear, and how basically every K-Bar knife is designed to be a rugged workhorse of a beater that could survive long-term military use, outdoor abuse, damn near any kind of apocalypse situation you could throw at it. A K-Bar knife's probably going to hold up better than the vast majority of stuff out there. So the grip and the ergos, the comfort in hand, all that stuff, this thing's pretty much got 3 positions, we'll say, where you could really kind of go to work with it. There's a bit of a choke up point here where it's got a little bit of a finger choil before that sharpening choil, and you can choke up a bit and get your thumb behind here if you need to do something fine woodwork, but not a fine woodworking knife, quite obviously. However, it is possible to choke up there fairly safely without having to worry about you nicking your finger on the bottom of that blade. The main grip here, what I would call like kind of the 2 main grips, I guess. The main grip I use is choked fully up at the top of the handle here, where I've got a pretty good grip and a pretty good ability to chop or slash or stab or cut whatever piece of wood or whatever I'm doing. Or if that grizz does come after me, I feel pretty good there, and it shouldn't really slide up my hand and girdle myself if I were to get in one of those weird situations. But the lower position here, if you want to get a lot of good chopping leverage, man, it's hard to have your hand slip out of that position. It locks in so tight, and if you really want to get a little crazy, you can throw that lanyard around, and now I can just hammer on anything with this knife and feel just about 100% confident that if anything goes down, it's not going to be me or the knife. It's going to be whatever I'm chopping. Don't know why you'd carry this or use it in a reverse grip unless you're left-handed like me, which is what I got to talk about the sheath later too. It's not ambidextrous, it's a pain in the ass. So when I draw this off my left side, I'm also mostly drawing it reverse grip, and it draws perfectly fine. It's very comfortable. If you ever had to, for whatever reason, I don't know why, had to use this knife in a reverse grip, very comfortable choking up or going to the end of it with your thumb, and choking up, you're still pretty good, and I don't really feel at all like my hand's going to slide up. Even though it doesn't have much of a handguard there compared to a lot of the knives I prefer, it's pretty secure in not allowing your hand to slide up. But yeah, ambidextrous wise, the knife itself is 100% ambidextrous. I hope I keep that freaking knife on screen, by the way. I got bad for drifting around in my own mind and pulling this knife towards me and not into the camera. Anyways, here is about as ambidextrous of a knife as you can ask for. No real issues there with most fixed blades. There's no reason not to make them ambidextrous, except that so many sheaths are right-handed only. So if I'm wearing this on my right hip, fine, except I don't like, especially for a fixed blade and a main go-to knife like that, I want that on my primary hand. Therefore, I've got to draw it reverse grip, which is not a huge issue if you're used to it and you're left-handed, but it's a pain in the ass because you always have to draw it like so and then reposition your hand to do normal knife stuff. So as far as a sou'paw approval rating for this knife, yes, for sure. Sou'paw approved as a knife, awesome. If you're going to carry this on your hip, sou'paw approval rating, we're going to say no. Just because it's not ambidextrous, I can't, it's a pain in the ass. But to be fair, a lot of people don't carry this like that. You can throw it in a backpack or do all kinds of other things with it. I, for a long time, have carried this either in like one of my little drawstring Under Armour bag. I'll carry my little man purse thing just to have it with me, or I'll throw this in one of my backpacks if I'm going in the woods for any amount of time. As much as I'd like to call this thing sou'paw approved, I just can't do it because with this sheath being not ambidextrous, based on that fact and that fact alone, I gotta say, no, this is not sou'paw approved. Although, like any knives, you can make it work. Left-handed people, we can adjust. We do it all of our lives. We'll be fine. While we're there, let's just talk a little more about the actual carry and how this thing does dangle off your hip. I'm sure a lot of folks aren't going to want to carry something this size and this weight on their hip. However, for me, if I'm going to carry something like this, if there's a reason for me to have this in the woods, I just don't want to have to haul it out of my backpack every time I need it, or again, for those stupid, crazy, one-of-a-million situations that if you were to get attacked by a bear or something, man, what a mess I'd be in if I had this thing in there and I knew there was no way I was going to be able to get to it. Do most of your normal brains need to work like that? No. Can you put this in your backpack and only haul it out when you need it like a normal person? Yes. I'm just saying, if it's ever in there and I really needed it, God, I'd be pissed. But the dangle carry is actually decent on this. You don't have to worry so much about this thing getting fetched up on, like, say, in a car seat or a helicopter or whatever the hell you're getting in and out of. Believe it or not, this thing does move around with you quite a bit, so long as you don't have that bottom lanyard attached. And again, there's supposed to be that loop down here in the bottom of the sheath, which would give you the ability to string some paracord or whatever through there and tie it off to your leg or something like that, if you really wanted that to stay secure to your leg. Depends on what you're doing. Just be mindful that if you're carrying this thing rough like I am, throwing it around everywhere, is that sheath's probably going to wear down over time. As far as getting this thing in and out of the sheath, it's not that bad. So for me, I'm doing it reverse like this. I would typically use my finger and my palm of my hand and just sort of give it a little twist like that and get the reverse grip. The lanyard obviously adds a little bit of extra annoyance if you're trying to get this thing out quickly. It's not that big of a deal, but with those snaps and the paracord, it can be a little bit, well, just annoying, I guess. I don't know what fancy word I was looking for, but it's not that big of a deal. If you are right-handed drawing this, it's a little bit easier. You just thumb and middle finger. It works a little bit better when it's fastened to your hip, and then you just like so. Or you could switch these around so that both snaps are facing the same direction. But it's just, I mean, that seems to me like it's going to be a lot more likely that you're going to accidentally undo both of them if you're walking through the woods or anywheres and you end up catching both of these in the same direction. A little bit harder to do that when one of them is facing the opposite direction. So preference, and depends on what you're doing, and depends on you if you're in a situation like you're walking around in the woods all day where you might lose this thing. Now, as for the aesthetics, the presentation, the public perception of this bad boy. Now, let's be real. K-Bar's not making these knives so that you can wear at a wedding or to a funeral. These are work knives, work tools, things that you're going to be able to use out in the woods or out in some kind of an environment where carrying something like this isn't going to catch people's attention, I'd imagine. If you do happen to forget to take this thing off of your hip after you've been working in the woods all day and you walk into the grocery store with it on, people are going to look at you odd. People are going to think you're strange, and people might think you're dangerous. Be careful. Try to remember not to bring something like this into a normal place with normal people who aren't into knives, who don't work outside. I'm not super crazy about the sheath or the looks of the sheath. It could be, I mean, I wouldn't even mind something like well, a full leather would be okay, but for me, I would prefer maybe some kind of a Kydex. Full nylon probably wouldn't be the way to go for this. I see what they're doing with the half leather, and the leather side has lasted quite a bit better than the nylon. I don't know. Could be different, could be better. But a full Kydex sheath this size, it probably would be a bit big and bulky, probably hard to manipulate around you a little bit. And heck, if you had to sit somewhere, like in a helicopter or in a vehicle with this for a long period of time, a big heavy Kydex, not heavy, but a big rigid Kydex sheath like that, probably going to be super uncomfortable. Maybe this is the way to go. It's just, Field reliability and durability. This thing is going to last you through most apocalypses, I'm sure. I mean, I haven't carried this into too many different apocalypses yet, but as far as I could tell, the amount of trees that I've whipped this thing at, which, again, I apologize, I know that drives people crazy, but if you had to put this thing through absolute hell and back, you might have a few nicks in the handle and the Crate & G polymer. You might maybe chip the blade if you're not careful, or if something happens that you happen to have like a slight manufacturer default, which I don't think is a real big thing with these guys. Like I said, there is that video on Late Boy Scouts channel where you do have that big chunky chip. I think he said it was at least the thickness of a nickel or something like that. So you could have something happen. It's a knife, not a hatchet. Hatchets can chip too. It's never going to be 100% impervious to damage, but boy, what a solid piece of metal if you had to have something hold up for you for a long period of time. So I have used this thing quite a bit on different wildland fire exports where we're doing different things like building camps or setting up kind of a lean-to shelter, or any number of things where we have a small number maybe of hand tools, axes and stuff like that, and then the rest of us are just kind of hacking away at it with folding saws and knives. This thing comes in real handy because you can do most axe things, any kind of small chopping tasks or carving or things like that with this knife that you could do with a small hatchet or machete. But it's still not the size of a full-blown machete, so you can still actually use it as a knife and do a lot of normal knife things with it. When you put it next to something like the CRKT Chance and Hell Bolo, it's pretty obvious that while this is a pretty big knife, once you see something like this, which is only as a small machete with like a 14-inch blade on it, I think. Let's check. 14-inch? No, 12-inch blade on it. So if you have something like this to chop and hack and do all that stuff, great. It's probably going to do a better job because that is what it's built for. But if you need to do knife stuff, this is not going to do anything for you. I mean, you can't really, I guess you can shave wood with it, but you can't really do any precision work. You can't really do anything that's going to allow you to, well, I guess control the tip or the blade. Just too big, just a little bit too imprecise. Now with this, you've got, again, the chopping power to get through something, but you can do all of your scraping, all your feather sticking, you can do any kind of digging or prying that you shouldn't probably do with the tip of your knife, but if you had to drill a hole into some wood or something, it could be done. And I'll say once more, do not do the dumb shit that I do, but if you did happen to throw this at a bunch of trees and it did happen to last after all the other stuff you'd done to it, you become pretty confident that this thing should last throughout pretty much any sort of terrible thing. We'll touch a little bit more on that in the apocalypse knife section right at the very end of the video. How about maintenance and cleaning for this thing? Well, obviously I don't clean this thing too often. I haven't done a lot of super high level maintenance like some folks do. There's a little bit of rust on the edge where the sharpened portion is not coated by that DLC coating. I believe that's a DLC coating. So along with the rust, there is a few big scratches and a few, I guess, scuff marks and stuff like that throughout the coating. But if this isn't supposed to be a showpiece for you, it shouldn't be a big deal. If you really wanted to, you could certainly fix that up a little bit and clean it after you use it. I'm sure if I polished that up and spent some time actually trying to make that look pretty, I'm sure I could. But I'm probably not gonna. What I should do, though, is do a little bit better job, as always, of remembering to try and oil these things afterwards. Once you sharpen them up, so long as you don't let that rust get deep and pit into there, it's not going to be a huge deal, but it's just good practice to keep that from rusting. Just to show you, the world will not end if you forget to put a little bit of oil on the end of your 1095 carbon steel, and I do live in the very salty environment of Atlantic Canada. So if you happen to be in a non-coastal area, I'm sure you can get away with not oiling this thing, and so long as you're not putting it away wet all the time, which this thing has been put away wet, you should be pretty damn good as far as that. Maintenance cleaning wise, and like the K-Bar 1211, the way that these handles are ribbed, you could get in there with probably a Q-tip or something, or even some compressed air, and clean that out without too much issue. Lanyard hole probably gets a little bit filthy inside of there with the amount of dirt and stuff that it gets exposed to. Other than that, there's a little tiny bit of space between the tang and the handle where it connects. Not a big deal. You shouldn't really have to worry about getting too much filth in there. Really, the only maintenance needed is to oil this thing. If you wanted to take care of the sheath, certainly you could take care of that leather a little better than I have and probably not bang it up quite as bad. And now that we've talked about all the sensible things, we're going to go into the hypothetical BS that I enjoy so much, which is if we did happen to get into some kind of a bad situation with this knife, would this thing last? Would this thing do whatever job we needed it to do? Would we feel comfortable carrying this if we ran into a worst case scenario? And for clarity, I'm just saying that in Canada, we cannot carry knives for self-defense. I'm not condoning the use of knives for self-defense or as weapons because these are work tools that we use as work tools. And if we get in a bad situation where this knife becomes a life-saving tool, hey, sometimes that happens. If, as a forest technician or any kind of a bush person or whatever you're doing out in the woods, you're carrying a knife, which you would be if you're out in the woods for the most part, if you're a sensible human being and you've done your due diligence to make sure that you've got your tools you need for survival. I work carpenter and I were walking around with a hammer in my belt all the time. If a coyote attacked me, I would be fighting back against that coyote. If I happened to be wearing a hammer on my hip, I'd grab that hammer and I'd beat that coyote's face in with it. If there are any serious animal lovers out there that are listening to this, I apologize. I'm not trying to say that I want to go and murder a bunch of animals in the forest, but wild animals are wild. They live in the wild, and natural selection's a real thing. If they think you're going to be food for them, which sometimes you end up in a bad situation where that happens, or you end up in between them and their young, you better believe that whatever I have on me is going to become a weapon. If I'm carrying a large stick, which sometimes I often will be, I'll be using that first. But to not make use of the tools you have on you because that you're not allowed to consider them as a self-defense tool in those situations, that's madness. So, just to be clear, I'm only talking about this in the context of wildlife self-defense. Gotcha? Okay, keep that in mind. So, if you had to use this in a defensive coyote situation, first of all, are you going to have this on you? Is this thing going to be in your backpack or on your hip? I like having things on my hip or on my appendix or somewhere. Obviously, you're not appendix carrying this, just to be clear. I mean, you do you, but I wouldn't want to accidentally fumble this thing when I was resheathing it. Now, because of those two snaps, this isn't going to be a very good tactical knife if you had to deploy it in a hurry. Not to say you couldn't, but it's not going to be as ideal as something with a quick snap or like something that's held in by that molded kydex, which is still going to have a lot of retention. You just have to give a little push with your thumb, but you don't have to worry about it falling out on you, but there's no extra snaps or buckles. You just get to draw it out. And this is the kind of sheath that most defensive or tactical knives, if you were police, law enforcement, military, something like that, this is what you'd be carrying. Not necessarily this cheap Smith & Wesson knife. This is just a fun $30, we'll call it an adult toy, a dangerous adult toy. That's not a toy, it's a tool, and it's just something I've been having fun training with. If you're able to get this thing out of the sheath, and that's very important, as much as it's fun to talk about the tactic part of it and all the would this thing perform well, this and that, if you can't get it out of the sheath, if it's not easily deployable, then there's really no point of talking about anything else. But if you did get it out of there, you're going to have a pretty good advantage over most people if they're hauling out any kind of pocket knife or any other sort of thing that they could possibly be carrying on their person, unless they're carrying a full-blown sword or a machete or a large Bowie knife kind of like this. Against a grizzly, I'm still screwed. I'm going to die 99 out of 100 times. But if I happen to run into that big grizz in the woods one of these days, I would so much rather have something like this than something like this. One thing I would improve on this if this were a combative knife, or if that's what you were using it for, or if you really wanted to make sure you didn't hurt yourself while defending yourself with this knife in those situations, I could use a little bit more of a handguard here. It would be nice. And like I've mentioned, I don't feel like this is going to slide. I don't feel like my hand or fingers are at risk. But if you really did jam into something and your grip got loosened up a little bit, it's not going to provide you the same amount of protection as something with a full handguard. However, it's not as awkward in the hand because of that, so you can choke up and move around a little bit. And as you're hacking around with this thing, it stays pretty firm in that grip. Like anything, there's a pro and con to it all, and it's just they tried to find, I think, the best balance for what they were trying to look for. And that being said, the way that this swedge is designed, you could actually sharpen the top of this with a little bit of effort and have a pretty dangerous large fighting knife on you. As well as the fact that with that swedge design and this clip point, you get very good penetration and withdrawal into that coyote and or bear without having to worry about the blade getting stuck or maybe even being so thick that it gets jammed up in a rib or something. bare rib. Okay, I'm getting off topic. That's enough of that. So let's talk about apocalypse capabilities. So would I bring this knife into an end of the world type situation? Now, like I mentioned, I have not been in a ton of apocalypses, but I would have to think from all of the, well, we'll say from the movies, TV shows, and all the other bullshit on the internet, as well as the actual military and prepper folks who spend a lot of time, maybe a little bit too much time in some cases, planning for these situations. There's a time and a place for a large knife, and sometimes you really need something like this. Sometimes you really benefit from having something like this over a small folder or a fixed blade. But if concealment and not looking like a threat is an issue, which it would be, your big issue is carrying something this size makes you look sketchy. It makes you look like a threat. And if I seen somebody walking around my apocalypse town with something like this, well, I'd probably be armed. I'd want to have something bigger than this or with bigger range, like a spear or a gun or something else. Wait, are we talking about defensive stuff or apocalypse? Well, it could be a defensive situation in an apocalypse. Holy crap, that's all ridiculous. And believe it or not, like shows like The Walking Dead and the premise of it, like I really do not enjoy the writing, the acting, and a lot of the stuff going on in those shows, but the human nature overlaying theme of the shit people do when stuff gets bad and people get desperate and cliques get made, gangs get formed, and bad shit starts happening. It's kind of what happens everywhere else in the world where there's no structured political system and or freedom and or democracy in most cases. So not crazy to talk about it, but I'm just kind of throwing that out there for the people who actually find themselves in those situations, because that is actually real life. It's a lot more real life than what we're used to in our modern world of computers and YouTube channels and tabletop knife reviews. Okay, rant over. But going back to the durability and reliability of this thing, that really does tie it into being a fairly solid end-of-the-world knife if you had to just have one large knife in your bag or something for emergency sake. This is a bit heavy, it's a bit cumbersome, but again, you could replace a hatchet or a machete with something like this for a lot of tasks, so long as you're smart about what you're doing and you're careful not to really bang this thing off of a rock or something if you skip off of a tree or a root. If you are still watching the video, maybe you're familiar with the channel and you're probably wondering what the H.O.G rating of this knife will be. Well, it's a lot more interesting to me than I'm sure it is to you, but at my scale of 1 to 10 as to where I stick this knife as overall hard-on gear approved, it's going to be a 8.5. What this rating's supposed to be really is my own subjective opinion of how overall well-rounded this knife is for what I need to use a knife for. Do I think the knife would hold up in that worst-case scenario where I might depend on it for my life or the life of somebody else? Could I beat this off of just about anything in the woods and expect that it's going to hold up? Because, I mean, as much as I'd like to say I wouldn't, that's going to happen with my gear. If I were in a situation in the woods or somewheres where I needed to use this knife for non-knife tasks, how much could I get away with? Do I like the comfort? Is it sou'paw approved enough that I can get away using it as a left-handed person? Do I think it's practical for my uses? With all those factors in mind, I stick this thing at an 8.5 just because it's not quite utilitarian enough for everything that a person like me would want to use it for. There's a reason this knife hasn't gotten a lot of use in the last few years, and that's because I've learned to adjust to things like the SE Azula 2 and the K-Bar 1211, just so I don't have to deal with something this large, deal with the conversations of having, people come up to me and say, oh, that's a big ass knife, which hey, I'm a knife guy and I do kind of like that stuff sometimes, but the older I get, the less I want attention drawn to myself, the less I want to have random conversations with people, and this knife is just a little too large. I would also like the sheath to be ambidextrous. That would bump it up a little bit. I'd also like a little bit more of a finger guard or a front finger choil that actually kind of protects your hand from sliding up over the blade. I'm kind of surprised they didn't come up with a new version of this or even keep this knife around instead of having it be discontinued, but I guess with the new Becker collaborations, you've got such a variety now of knives that are kind of in this same range with 1095, which is essentially the same as the 1085 steel. There's really, I guess, no reason to keep this knife on the market if it wasn't selling compared to those new models. But if you're interested, check out the secondary market. Go look for one of these bad boys. Definitely don't be afraid to pick one up because they're super awesome, super fun to use, and they're kind of fun to haul out in the woods if you're doing some kind of a camping task or anything like that. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see where my fixed blade preferences have landed after 8-9 years of using large, ridiculous things like this, you can check out my SE Azula 2 video where I go well in depth about all the things you might want to know about the SE Azula. I really tried to create the one SE Azula 2 video that you would need to watch if you were trying to get all the information. And as you can see, this thing's use and abuse rating is climbing very quickly, and I need to get better at oiling the surface of my blades, which I'm bad for, so that's starting to get some rust. And this thing's getting some use, but it's a lot of outdoor use, and I sometimes put it back in the sheath wet. Yeah, take a look at that video, and if you want to support the channel, I appreciate you hitting the like button, as that'll get this video out to more people. And subscribe if you haven't already. If you'd like to get the notifications every time a video comes out on Monday, and then some extras, just hit the notification bell, turn that on, and comment if you have anything that you want to tell me about your K-bar large heavy Bowie experiences, if you've got one and you enjoy it. If you don't like it, I'd love to know why, because I can't see who wouldn't like this big bad K-bar Bowie knife. And keep an eye out for when the H.O.G channel hits that 1,000 subscriber mark, because I will be doing my first knife giveaway of some hard-use fixed blade or folder, something like the Essie Azula No. 2, or perhaps the Manix 2 from Spyderco, some hard-on gear approved knife in that range of about $100, $200. In the meantime, there's going to be all kinds of great knife content coming out in the coming weeks and months, so keep an eye out for that. For now, this is the Hard On Gear channel, signing off.